We exchanged a few words last week when we had our first session concerning the remit of this particular seminar on religious enthusiasm. And of course the question of enthusiasm, as we, in the way we spoke about it last week, has to do with extraordinary states of consciousness which lead to extraordinary kinds of actions, both private and collective. And I would remind us all that Tevelite, who will be speaking in a few weeks, when speaking about Breivik, who perpetrated the massacre outside of Oslo, might be diagnosed or might be studied according to various types of to various concepts of psychology or psychopathology, but after all, we need to treat Breivik not as a psychotic case or as a special case, because Breivik is in fact a doer and not entirely a patient. So being a doer and being a patient, there are two ways of looking at persons who perform extraordinary acts, and it is really at this confluence of psychology, sociology, explanation, and the deed itself, where the question being dealt with today actually comes in, fraternity and fear, because fraternity and fear are in fact involved in all of these matters that are of concern to us in this particular seminar. I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker, who is, as you probably know, some of you will certainly know, is a philosopher and a social and political theorist, the author of an extraordinary book on fanaticism, on the genealogy of the word, the genealogy of the concept, its uses across the ages from its inception at the time of the Reformation and thereafter. And we thought that he would be the most fitting first speaker in this particular seminar, because what he had to say in that book would actually then set the tone and set a number of parameters which should and can guide our discussions in this particular seminar. He is proposing to speak on fraternity and fear in the global civil war. Now, we shall soon find out what he means by the global civil war and which global civil war he's talking about. Just one last comment before the further introduction. I was talking to a particularly interesting philosopher today over lunch, Marcus Gabriel from Germany, who has a very interesting theory of fanaticism. Fanaticism is according to him, a meta-philosophical notion which is based primarily upon the contention that difference does not exist or can be actually then written out of any form of workable existence. So it is something which actually then transcends social interaction and political interaction. That is another matter which we will come to later on. But now I will ask our speaker to tell us what he has in mind concerning fraternity and fear in the global civil war. By way of brief introduction, he teaches at Goldsmiths College, the University of London, and he has forthcoming two books with extraordinary titles which I find intriguing, and I look forward to reading them. One is Last Philosophy, which may be redolent of The Last Man to some of us, but then may not be necessarily, and The Bad New, Politics in a Tragic Key. And prior to that, another book with an extremely interesting and intriguing title, The Cartographies of the Absolute. Anyway, if any of you have any questions on these particular matters, you may address them to our speaker once he has concluded what he has to say. Please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Lasma, and thanks to the Central University and everybody involved for the invitation. And it's, of course, quite an honor to be selected to start off a seminar like this. The reference to Marcus Gabriel, incidentally, is curious, thinking back to writing the book Fanaticism, because I know he's a specialist of the work of Schelling, and actually the first time I encountered and thought about the notion of fanaticism was quite a long time ago. In fact, in 1999, which is, I think, the first time I published an article which had fanaticism in its title, but had nothing to do with the relationship between religion and politics, but rather concerned precisely this philosophical notion of fanaticism as it traveled through Kant, through Schelling, through Hegel, and in particular this notion of fanaticism in German philosophy, as what Kant said, the notion, or indeed the philosophical delusion, that one can immediately see the infinite, or that one can kind of identify oneself with the absolute. So it was curious to be returned to that more philosophical territory. So what I want to do today is, in a sense, to bridge the project of that book, Fanaticism. That was a book written at a very, or at least I started to write at a very particular moment, mid-2000s, and partly just out of a sense of irritation, I guess would probably be the best word, at the ways in which this term, whose political and philosophical pedigree I had somehow been alerted to earlier on, the way that this term was being manipulated or operationalized, in a sense, to present a very schematic, one could say even very Manichaean understanding of the relationship between politics and religion, and specifically the way it was being turned into a pretty significant, ideological and opinion-forming operator in the context of the so-called global war on terror. So it was really a critical project, trying to dislocate the seemingly self-evident discourse about fanaticism by turning to various historical and political episodes in which it had played a signal role. Among them, as Professor Alasme mentioned, the radical Reformation, but also the way in which fanaticism had been a key term in the Cold War discourse, specifically US-centered and kind of State Department-centered, I suppose, discourse around communism in the 1950s and 1960s, specifically around this discussion of communism as a secular or political religion. And that itself went back to a very long tradition, a tradition that I guess one could call quite technically, in a sense, almost quite neutrally, a sort of counter-revolutionary tradition around the notion of fanaticism, which had indeed developed in the wake of the French Revolution, and specifically in what I think is the most formidable and fascinating text of what we could see as a kind of anti-fanatical tradition, that is to say Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. Now we can discuss, if you're interested, some of the aspects of what I was arguing in that book, but what I want to do today is really bridge that project with some of the concerns that I suppose are guiding my current research around this relationship between politics and the notion of tragedy. And in particular, to try to think different approaches to the problem of the relationship between the formation of collective subjectivity, which is really what I'll be talking about in terms of fraternity, and questions of social, political, and indeed religious conflict. I'll just move straight to the paper, and hopefully these relationships, conceptual and historical relationships I've just been mentioning, will be apparent. So a number of commentators reflecting on the most recent surge of religiously articulated violence, and especially on the internationalization of the Islamic State or Daesh phenomenon, have foregrounded the primacy of collective and primarily masculine forms of solidarity over theological discourses as engines of so-called radicalization. Now, I use this clumsy formulation, religiously articulated, because partly what I think is at stake in this discussion of fraternity is whether one can indeed speak of religiously motivated action. So in a sense, I'm saying religiously articulated to sort of suspend the idea that, suspend and then maybe revisit the idea that we can treat the religious as, in a sense, the primary motor or engine of subjectivation in these cases. So in terms of this turn to the question of, so to speak, fraternal or kind of like masculine solidarities, and here I guess there are resonances of the Tevelite male fantasies, so we could also, I guess, write a whole book about ISIS called Male Fantasies, but we can maybe revisit that. But in terms of these debates, I'm thinking in particular of the recent work of the anthropologist Scott Atran, who had already, on what I personally think are rather problematic evolutionary sociobiological grounds, argued in his 2010 book, Talking to the Enemy, that the model of an ideologically determined kind of terror is central, sort of the model which in a sense kind of repeats some of the more paranoid police models of how anarchism worked in the 19th century, that you needed a kind of center, be it Al-Qaeda or ISIS or what have you, and that this itself was a hierarchical and centrifugal sort of system of organization, should be radically revisited, replaced by a fine-grained ethnographic, biographic, and psychological grasp of the significance of bonds of friendship and family, and of mutable and improvised networks in the most recent wave of Islamist mass terrorism. So specifically, Atran looks in quite some detail, pretty fascinating detail at that, in Talking to the Enemy, at the genesis of the Bali and Madrid bombings of the earlier 2000s, looking actually at how little any kind of centralized or hierarchical organization had to do with the actual dynamics of these movements. So in a 2015 editorial, specifically about ISIS in The Guardian, does that work? Am I doing it? Okay, here we go. Sorry. Something happened. One of the slides disappeared. I must have deleted it by mistake, so I'll just read out the quote. So in this 2015 editorial on ISIS in The Guardian, Atran refers to a 2014 French poll, a rather fascinating poll. And he says the following: the poll suggests that more than one in four French youth between the ages of 18 and 24 have a favorable or very favorable opinion of ISIS, although only 7 or 8% of France is Muslim. It's communal. More than 3 of every 4 who join ISIS from abroad do so with friends and family. Most are young in transitional stages in life, immigrant students between jobs and mates, having just left their native family. They join and this is his expression, a band of brothers, and in parentheses, and I guess the parentheses are significant, and sisters, ready to sacrifice for significance. It's a kind of interesting formulation, to sacrifice for significance. So Atran, trying to shake the reader out of her ideological slumber, provocatively concludes the following. He says, jihad is an egalitarian, equal opportunity employer, fraternal, fast-breaking, glorious, cool, and persuasive. And there's a variant of this argument in a quite interesting speech that he gives, I think relatively recently. You can find it on YouTube at the UN. So while unable to follow Atran into the field, so to speak, I want to take this opportunity to pause on that adjective fraternal, and to take it as a prism through which to revisit and revise some of the ideas I tried to advance in my book, Fanaticism, especially in that book's preoccupation with the political and philosophical frameworks through which we understand the refusal of compromise. And here I'm referring to, in particular, some of the work of a friend who rather tragically passed away before finishing his book on fanaticism called American Zealots, Joel Olson, who very nicely defined fanaticism as the extraordinary mobilization of the refusal to compromise. So prolonging my decision to think the discourse of fanaticism in a manner transversal to the distinction between secular, for instance communist or anarchist, and religious, for instance Islamist forms of politics, I wish to reflect here on the place of fraternity in the modern political vocabulary, and on its intersection with our understanding of excessive or violent political commitments. Inasmuch as the problem of fraternity was posed from ancient Greek political philosophy to French revolutionary discourse and further on, as a problem concerning both the unity of the political body and the threat of civil war, with the latter very often conceived, that is to say civil war, as the worst modality of violence, which is something that really determines Greek political philosophy for certain once you look at it with some level of closeness, I want to test out whether we can look in the archives of political philosophy for some of the tools through which to think the collective subjectivity of political and religious violence in a context that some commentators have identified as one of global civil war, and I'll turn to that term in a second. Now, a proviso or a kind of warning is called for. This conceptual sketch, which seeks to supplement my discussion of fanaticism by inquiring into the political effects of group formation, is confined to a very selective and very partial trajectory within Western philosophy, and would itself require being supplemented, or indeed supplanted or surpassed, by a critical consideration of other understandings and political traditions, indeed non-Western traditions, of fraternity. So now for part one, there's 3 parts to the paper. The reference to global civil war in my title is drawn from Giorgio Agamben's recent work, his short volume entitled Stasis, which is one of the last 2 volumes of this kind of gargantuan and strangely organized Homo Sacer series. The book is a reflection on the figures of civil war in the Western political tradition, principally in ancient Greece and in the work of Hobbes, which tries to recover the resources of that unstable and polysemic Greek concept, stasis, which is indeed one of the Greek names for civil war. There is a name of a whole number of things, including what we call stasis, as opposed to kinesis or movement. And Agamben tries to recover this concept of stasis to intervene intellectually in a situation where the very distinctions between internecine war, so what the Greeks indeed call stasis, and war between states, which in some ways resembles the Greek concept of polemos, or war against non-Greeks, or war against barbarians, that this distinction between internal and external war, in a sense to put it quite plainly, seems to have effectively imploded. And where, notwithstanding the coining of that formula, global civil war, so that at least according to Agamben, I haven't looked into it independently, but the concept of global civil war is first used simultaneously in 1963 by Hannah Arendt in her book on revolution, and by Carl Schmitt in his book, The Theory of the Partisan. So notwithstanding the coining of that formula, global civil war, sorry, passage is a little. So to turn to this question of civil war, notwithstanding the fact that from Plato through Hobbes and into modern political philosophy, the preemption of civil war is constitutive, arguably, of European conceptions of politics as such. We can also think here, for instance, of Jacques Derrida's comment in The Politics of Friendship, a text to which I'll turn in a moment, about the state stasis as a category of what he calls political nosography, or that is to say, the diagnosis of the maladies of public and collective life. As Agamben observes, whatever date one wishes to trace this end back to, it is certain that today the state of war in the traditional sense has virtually disappeared. Now, we might want to argue with this, but take this sentence for the time being. Though the scholarly response, by and large, has been oriented towards varieties of crisis management, and not to confronting the crisis of political practice and rationality itself that such a collapse of the normative framework of war entails. Now, in order to elaborate his hypothesis that civil war can be understood as a threshold of politicization and depoliticization in what he calls the political paradigm of the West, Agamben turns to the protean and incisive work of the historian of ancient Greek thought and politics, Nicole Laurent. Laurent is also a crucial reference for Derrida's Politics of Friendship, to which I'll turn later. commenting on Plato's dialogue, Menexus, Laurent had already sought to elucidate the fundamental ambivalence in ancient Greek political thought and indeed political practice, haunting the relationship between the oikos, so the domain of the family or the home, and the polis. And Agamben makes the following comment. He writes, civil war is the stasis emphilos. It is the conflict particular to the philon, to blood kinship. It is to such an extent inherent to the family that the phrase ta emphilia, literally the things internal to the bloodline, simply means, in ancient Greece, civil wars. Now, that incidentally is a 19th century painting of Antigone looking over the body of Polynices from the Sophocles play. And one can, of course, see, especially through the prism of Laurent's work, who writes about this in a number of her books and essays, the whole question of tragedy and of tragedy's capacity to think and to stage politics as indeed a thinking of civil war, which revolves around the relationship between the family and the polis. And yet, it is the family in ancient Greek thought that also serves as the antidote to the malady it itself incubates. So there's a kind of ambivalence, which is of course in many ways what tragedy is about, of the family as cause and the family as solution of this problem of internecine war. One of the ways the family does this, to which we'll return, is by the creation of a kind of civic or symbolic or invented kinship. And indeed, fraternity, politically understood, is nothing but a form of symbolic or invented kinship. And more specifically, by fashioning a kind of political brotherhood, which combines reflexivity with reciprocity. Laurent, in fact, narrates in one of her essays, it was indeed the one that I put on the reading list on the politics of brothers, a case in ancient Greek inhabited or dominated Sicily, in the town of Nakone, of a reconciliation following a stasis, so following a kind of localized civil war, which depends on the act or on the oath of what in Greek is called adelphothetia, that is to say, to adopt one another as brothers. And it's a very interesting essay about how the solution to the civil war is basically to invent, to scramble the otherwise feuding or antagonistic kinship and bloodlines into a sort of entirely artificial form of fraternity, where you would, in a sense, adopt as a brother a member of the opposing faction. The horizon of Greek thinking of conflict, which also organizes a constant disavowal so this repression of stasis, Laurent also notes in some quite striking instances, for instance, the fact that the Athenians remove from the calendar the date of their of a crucial moment of stasis. So you have this very strange situation in which the possibility of civil war is both forgotten but obviously entirely remembered, because if you move from the 2nd to the 4th of January, you're sort of, elicited the notion that on the 3rd of January something incredibly bad happened, even though that day doesn't exist anymore. This is a very interesting way of thinking, this kind of dialectic of amnesia and remembering that is, in many ways central to political memory and the political memory of conflict. This way of thinking conflict ultimately crystallizes into the notion of what she calls a generalized civic kinship. So in a sense, what we get from Laurent is this notion that at the root of ancient Greek political thought, and therefore at least at the root of one of the streams which then composes, for want of a better term, a kind of European or indeed perhaps Western political tradition, there is a really constitutive role given to a kind of political brotherhood or indeed a notion of civic kinship, which is, in a sense, the other side of the utterly central role that civil war and its prevention have in the entire thinking of politics. This stems, according to Leroux, to what she calls, intriguingly, quote, the Greek tendency to transform blood kinship categories into merely classificatory categories. The ultimate ideal, then, is not even so much that of the adelphoi, which is a kind of singular and indeed more familial notion of brotherhood, but that of the fratres, whose collectivity, as she puts it, is a solidarity of definition and, ideally, free from all tensions. Now, for Georgia Agamben, Leroux's thesis, especially as formulated in her landmark 1987 essay on war in the family, can be summarized in 3 steps. So first, her work shows an attention to how stasis, or civil war, deconstructs the idea that Greek politics is marked by an overcoming of the oikos by the polis. So this is a very familiar narrative, and indeed a kind of self-narrative already present in Greek thought itself, that somehow the city transcends the family or the oikos or the home, and it circumscribes its role, but in a sense maintains it in its proper place, and therefore terminates the possibility of civil war. Of course, this narrative, or indeed this ideal, or even this myth, is present in what is perhaps the most emblematic tragedy in this regard, which is Aeschylus's Oresteia, in which the feminine power of revenge, and indeed as embodied in the Erinyes or the Furies, is domesticated, in a sense, literally by the figure of Athena, and the polity is precisely founded on this institution of a form of kinship which is civic, but also a form of kinship which is male, and there's a whole very complex politics around gender and civil war, which Leroux is very attentive to. For one, just incidentally, one of the crucial political responses and practical responses to the problem of civil war, which is to say to internecine conflict, to revenge, and so on, is the prohibition on female mourning in Athens. So the state regulation of mourning as that which constantly throws up the possibility of future revenge. So the first point then is that stasis, viewed from this angle, does not, stasis is not to be really thought as a surpassing of the polis, the oikos by the polis. Second, stasis is essentially originating in the oikos, at least according to Agamben's reading of Leroux, and reveals the ineluctable presence, the fact that the family, but the family as conflict, continues to haunt the polity no matter how much it tries to surpass it. And third, again, this is Agamben kind of summarizing Leroux's work, the oikos is an ambivalent formation, a source of discord and consensus alike. Against the grain of these theses, and arguing on the basis of his interpretation of the biopolitical foundation of Western thought, so that for Agamben, the crucial separation is the one between what he calls bios, or political life, and zoe, or bare, animal, biological life, an argument that he makes in Homo Sacer, Agamben suggests that stasis should instead be considered as what he calls a threshold. Commenting on a passage in Plato's Laws, Agamben notes, what follows from the text of the law that the Athenian of the Platonic dialogue proposes is less the connection between stasis and oikos than the fact that the civil war assimilates and makes undecidable brother and enemy, inside and outside, household and city. In the stasis, the killing of what is most intimate is indistinguishable from the killing of what is most foreign. This means, however, that the stasis does not have its place within the household, but constitutes a threshold of indifference between the oikos and the polis, between blood kinship and citizenship. This is a threshold for Agamben, of both de- and refamiliarization. In a sense, he sees Greek political thought as constantly trapped in this kind of ambivalence and oscillation. politicization and depoliticization, familiarization and refamiliarization. Notwithstanding Agamben's critical observations, I think some of Laureau's other writings, namely her magisterial work, The Divided City, from which the essay The Politics of Brothers is taken, suggest she is a very attentive explorer of this dimension of the threshold, not least around the question of brotherhood. There, in that book, while noting a kind of ideology of fraternal kinship in Greece, and she of course notes that this is one of the things that really separates the Greek thinking of civil war from the Roman thinking of civil war. Roman thinking of civil war has as its obsession not fratricide but parricide. So it's a very different understanding. And the worst, in a sense, the worst in the Roman context is the son killing the father, or indeed the father killing the son, rather than this fraternal war. But the ultimate ideology of fraternal kinship in Greece is that, as she puts it, no real or blood or family kinship bond must interfere with the bond instituted by the city. It's almost as if the principle of this conception of politics were that political brotherhood should always trump kin or blood brotherhood. So that what we find in Greek thought, according to her, is ultimately, in Greek political thought, is a logic in a sense beyond and against the family, which reveals, in her words, the contradiction endlessly opposing the family to itself, eternally suspected of bringing both too much cohesion and too much division. She also places brotherhood itself, so to speak, on the threshold of politics. I quote, "Caught between the vertical axis of filiation and the horizontal axis of companionship, the brother, as a kind of figure of the political, oscillates from one to the other, without ever filling in the gap between blood kinship and the reciprocity of fellow men." So in a sense, the brother ends up being this unstable, ambivalent figure, which though ideally is supposed to allow for the transcendence of blood kinship by political kinship, actually serves much more in the sense as that kind of threshold of which Agamben spoke. In that sense, we can also think through this kind of fraternal volatility or fraternal trouble, what Laureau pointedly identified as the denial of conflict as the law of politics and life in the city. In fact, the whole of The Divided City is precisely a book about how the Greek, so to speak, invention of politics, a much celebrated idea that the Greeks invented politics or invented democracy, is also the invention of all of these ways of denying, disavowing, and repressing the conflicts that are at the heart of political life, and specifically stasis or civil war and its possibility. Of course, you can think of classic ancient philosophy as one of the privileged sites of this attempt to quell or quash conflict in some way. Its most philosophical, famous philosophical figure perhaps is to be found in the utopian, or in a sense communist fraternity, and indeed sorority of Plato's Republic, in which Plato imagines the generation of a stock of citizens who are only children of the city, but not of their parents, brothers and sisters in and for the city, a process which of course requires, and Plato is very open about this, a formidable mythological, which is to say ideological manipulation, much of which being involved in this incredibly peculiar technical discussion of how you can prevent incest amongst these brothers and sisters if indeed they do not know who their parents are in the first place. Leaving blood kinship behind, as we know, can and has been a very bloody process implicating our very notions of citizenship. When Laureau asks why there is such consensus to make consensus the bond of politics, the question of political brotherhood is surely in the foreground. So now to my second part. Now, this question of political brotherhood is indeed in the foreground of the work of Jacques Derrida, especially in his book, which is drawn from a seminar of the 1980s, The Politics of Friendship. A text which wagers on the possibility of thinking politics, in Derrida's words, beyond the principle of fraternity. So beyond the principle of fraternity. So just what, in a sense, the Greeks, at least according to Leroux, could not do. The context for this questioning is what he calls, I quote, a harrowing tremor in the structure of the experience of belonging, therefore of property, of communal belonging and sharing, religion, family, ethnic groups, nations, homeland, country, state, even humanity, end of quote. Derrida poses a complex and haunting question. Can politics in the West, but perhaps also in the globalized and dominated rest, be thought of outside of what he calls a schematic of filiation? A schematic which would link the production and reproduction of human life to a fundamentally paternal patriarchal recognition. And can politics exist outside of what he terms the possibility of a fraternization, a possibility which he thinks is inextricable from what in another formulation he calls Christianization. Derrida writes, fraternization is the essential structure of Christianization, as though Christian proselytism were the imposition of the political figure of the brotherhood on non-fraternal cultures. In trying to extricate the political valences of friendship, as instantiated in Plato, Aristotle, Montaigne, Michelet, and many more, from autochthony, eugenics, and filial and fraternal bonds, is Derrida trying to repeat and intensify, or even exaggerate, that gesture of trying to overcome the oikos in and by the polis that both Leroux and Agamben discuss? So one can, reading Derrida, think that perhaps he's also caught in this kind of utopia, we could leave the family behind and finally have true and proper politics. But as we've stressed, in its Greek form, this separation from the oikos always appears to take the form of its symbolic sublimation. So at least for the Greeks, every time you try to get away from kinship, you do so by inventing political kinship, not by doing something that's not kinship. So the articulation of the political and the biological, or of the city and the family, is never really left behind. It's kind of euphemized, metaphorized, sublimated, or what have you. There's a kind of natural law based on the bond between, in Derrida's formulations, the bond between the political and autochthonous consanguinity, the sharing of blood and the belonging to a territory or land. And he continues, we should be alert to the place of fraternization as the symbolic bond alleging the repetition of a genetic tie. Nature persists in commanding law, in treating equality as an attribute of birth, as in the Greek derivation of isegolia, the right to equal speech, from isogonia, the fact of equal birth. This nature is doubled by memory, by a testamentary tie, which is also an originary patrimony. As Derrida puts it, the obligatory necessity of this bond of memory, so there's a kind of fraternity that also has to do with a conception of history and a conception of origin, forms the condition of a certain notion of political freedom. So what would a democracy be, a democracy to come in Derrida's famous formulation, that would not base or ground political appearance or political belonging on the vertical axis of filiation, and indeed of fundamentally patrilinear filiation, and or the horizontal line of fraternal solidarity? What would a democracy be which would not be, in Derrida's terms, an aristodemocracy of brothers according to virtue, the right of the best, starting from equality at birth, from national, homophilial, autochthonous equality? A democracy of, in a paradox or oxymoron, what he calls countable singularity, which would forbid the imposition of a numerus clausus, or a closed number, on what he calls the arrivant. It is worth pausing to reflect on the way that the question of fraternity intersects what Derrida calls the question of number, namely the tragic tension between what he argues are the two laws of otherness. I quote, hopefully that one's there, yes. There is no democracy without respect for irreducible singularity or alterity, but there is no democracy without the community of friends, without the calculation of majorities, without identifiable, stabilizable, representable subjects, all equal. These two laws are irreducible to one another. What is at stake for Derrida against Schmidt, who is one of his main interlocutors in the politics of friendship, is the very possibility of thinking what he calls a politics, a friendship, a justice, which begin by breaking with their naturalness or their homogeneity, with their alleged place of origin. So what would be a politics that wouldn't, in some way or another, sublimate this origin, an origin which is always, at the very least, a metaphor of a kind of biological or natural fraternity? Such a break would perhaps above all mean breaking with what he sees as the androcentric, or famous or infamous formulation, phallogocentric character of our conception of the political, in which, as he puts it, the sister, and this is very interesting vis-a-vis the discussion in Loho, in which, as he says, the sister will never provide a docile example for the concept of fraternity. Going against the grain of Schmidt's theory of the partisan, Derrida will in fact ask, what if the woman were the absolute partisan, and what if she were the absolute enemy of this theory of the absolute enemy, the specter of hostility to be conjured up for the sake of the sworn brothers? End of quote. Is it possible for our politics to move beyond the brother, and can we heed this call to denaturalize fraternity? Now, we can parenthetically note the interest of Derrida's pausing in his interpretation of the notorious friend-enemy distinction in Carl Schmitt's concept of the political on the exemplary place that the political conflict against Islam has in the history of the Christian West. This is a bit of off-piece for my talk, but since it's in the politics of friendship, I thought it would interestingly fit perhaps with some of our discussion. Derrida's reflection on Schmitt is particularly, and I think intentionally unsettling, because of its reflexive form, as though he were including himself within that Christian or European political brotherhood. As he writes, "You are obliged," this is very odd use of this kind of vocative form. It's not clear if Derrida is talking to Schmitt, if he's talking to himself, if he's talking to us, or who this us might be. "You are obliged, you will always have been obliged to defend Europe against its other without confusing the genres, without confusing faith and politics, enmity and hostility, friendship and alliance or confusion." And there's an interesting question here, of course, of the extent to which Derrida himself is committed to a certain, perhaps particularly French version of political secularism, albeit in a quite oblique way. In question would be a defensive operation destined to defend the political beyond particular states or nations, beyond any geographical, ethnic, or political continent. On the political side of this unusual front, the stakes would be saving the political as such, ensuring its survival in the face of another who would no longer even be a political enemy, but an enemy of the political. More precisely, a being radically alien to the political as such, supposing at least that, in its purported purity, it is not Europeanized and shares nothing of the tradition of the juridical and the political called European. These lines uncannily foreshadow the more enlightened, in many scare quotes, versions of contemporary Islamophobic discourses with their obsessive demand that the other adopt a certain framework of the political from which we are at the same time trying, one could argue, in a kind of imposed consensus to expunge all substantive forms of conflict. Namely, any conflict over the very forms of politics and the state of the kind that mobilized much of Europe throughout the 20th century. Ironically, we are thus witness to a strange spectacle of a kind of culturalist defense of democratic politics as a sort of Western or European property, which is actually the other side of a fiercely anti-democratic and anti-political practice. And now to my third and last part. In the politics of friendship, Derrida insists, as I suggested, on the necessity to deconstruct what are only apparently denaturalized fraternities. So his very insistent point is actually fraternity can never, or seems never to be able to undo its link to a land, to an ethnos, to some kind of substantive, perhaps biological, perhaps racial identity. In that sense, he wants to deconstruct a whole tradition of thinking from Aristotle onwards of spiritual fraternity, of sovereign fraternity, of fraternities of what he calls alliance or election. And he asks himself, and he asks us, why does the natural schema remain? So why is it that politics must always be thought of in some relationship to a kind of basic understanding of natural origins, something that is obviously present, for instance, most strikingly in the whole etymology of the word nation, its relationship to birth, and so on and so forth. I want to turn now, by way of conclusion, to what is arguably the most concerted and in many ways intense effort to think the centrality of fraternity to political group formation and to the generation of political intensity, but also political violence. Jean-Paul Sartre's theory of what he called fraternity terror, expounded in his 1960 Critique of Dialectical Reason, Volume 1. As an aside, this was a text that, though sadly the transcripts of these lectures don't exist anymore, was the object of one of Frantz Fanon's last seminars, which was actually given to the Algerian Army of the Exterior in Tunisia. A very strange notion that you would, I don't know if you've tried to read Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, but the idea of teaching it at a military camp is, far-fetched, to say the least, but speaks to the kind of intensity of Fanon's relationship, not just to that book and not just to Sartre, but to that particular argument. So could Sartre perhaps provide some clues to the predicament with which I began, namely the preeminence of fraternization, say following those arguments by Scott, Atwood, and others, as a source of so-called radicalization? I say so-called a bit like people keep saying so-called Islamic State, because I actually find radicalization to be an incredibly problematic term, but maybe we can discuss that later. Sartre's critique is a vast and at times forbiddingly, actually not at times, it's like constantly forbiddingly complex book. So I will need to bracket the bulk of his argument and its underlying development, and above all, his advancing of what he calls scarcity as a contingent but inescapable origin of conflict, and in a sense of dialectical thinking itself. What I will do is simply sketch the guiding lines of his notion of fraternity terror, which emerge about halfway through the more than 800 pages of the book, as Sartre tries to grapple with the passage, which is critical in his narrative, from the atomized multiplicity of human groups, what Sartre calls seriality, so existing in a kind of series of atoms, to the unity of groups which totalize themselves and seek to act in unison. And in a sense, Sartre is trying to think the collective nature of revolutionary subjectivity with, in many ways, the French and Russian revolutions as his principal objects of speculation. Reflecting on revolutionary conjunctures especially, Sartre calls our attention to the moment, to that experience which, borrowing from André Malraux's account of the Spanish Civil War, he calls the apocalypse, the dissolution of a serial collective into a group infusion. This is a kind of political subjectivation as a kind of apocalypse in the sense of both an extremely violent event, but also a revelation of a kind of new identity. Crucially for Sartre, this group, and this is very important about Sartre's thinking of groups, is not a kind of hyper-organism. It's not a kind of macro individual. It's still very much a group made up of a multiplicity of individuals, but individuals which are transformed by their belonging to the group. The group is above all for Sartre, as he puts it himself, a passion, a constantly renewed and at times tortured struggle against practical inertia, against all the social and psychic forces which, if unresisted, would spell the group's demise or its dissolution. So to be in a group for Sartre is to fight the natural tendency to no longer be in a group, in a sense. And this in many ways explains the whole problematic of terror and violence. I do not know whether Derrida had the critique somewhere at the back of his mind in writing Politics of Friendship, but his repeated references to the oath or the pledge, le serment, as a crucial operator in political fraternities echoes the pride of place of this concept in Sartre's theory of group formation, where it is only the free decision to fuse into a group, which also means to treat oneself from the standpoint of a third internal to that group, which, according to Sartre, invents the very possibility of treason or betrayal. So it's a very curious move for Sartre, whereby the oath is, in a sense, the oath not to betray, the oath, in a way, to be the punishers of one's own possible betrayal, but in that sense it invents the very experience of treason. In seriality or in atomized collective life, nobody can really betray anything or anyone. And it institutes the violence of the group against itself, a violence which is inextricable from its unity. The fear in fraternity is ultimately twofold. On the one hand, it is the fear of scarcity, a fear, or better, an anxiety directed at the other as a danger to our survival. And for Sartre, this is kind of anthropologically fundamental in some sort of speculatively sort of Malthusian sense. You know, the other is fundamentally a danger before he is, an object of ethics or of solidarity or whatever. Our experience of otherness is fundamentally determined by this experience of the other as a possible danger to my own survival or to our own survival. It's a pretty bleak view of human nature, but at times a persuasive one. But on the other hand, it is a fear of time as that which will disperse our unity. It is a fear, and this is a very curious but I think persuasive formulation, the fear in fraternity is a fear of the absence of fear. It's a fear that fear will no longer be present, and therefore there will be no motor for our solidarity, and it is this absence of fear that the oath or pledge negates. So Sartre has a curious model whereby, in a sense, the group internalizes the external danger and turns that possible danger of violence against itself in order to maintain its unity. And, in some way, Sartre is really trying to think concretely through, a very familiar phenomenon, especially from the history of left-wing movements, that being, the constant seeming necessity of the internal purge as the only way that you maintain group unity. Fraternity is fraternity terror. Inasmuch as to maintain cohesion and homogeneity, the group must, in his words, reinvent fear. Fear is thus what Sartre calls a free product of the group, aimed at preempting its serial dispersion, grounded in the absolute self-willed violence over the group of its own members. In his terminology, the oath, or the pledge, reactualizes violence as the negation of individual freedom by common praxis, making it so that hope is inextricable from terror and freedom from violence. This oath or pledge, in which I swear that I will not be the conduit for serial alterity and multiplicity into the group, I will not betray, I will not dissolve, is, like Leroux's family in a sense, an intrinsically ambivalent or better dialectical fashion. It serves to unify the group in reciprocity, but it's also the source of separation and differentiation, as one can see in the whole history precisely of the violence that groups do to themselves to remain united. The meaning of fraternity in Sartre is nicely foregrounded in the anti-psychiatrist R.D. Laing's synopsis of the theory of groups from his book Reason and Violence, co-authored with David Cooper. And if you don't have the time or inclination or fortitude to slog through the 800 pages of Sartre, Laing's summary is, which has Sartre's kind of blessing, so to speak, is quite an effective one. And so in Laing's version, he says, this is just, it's not even him interpreting, it's just him kind of summarizing Sartre's argument. In the pledge group, there is liable to exist also a mortal concern for my co-member, my brother, he who is linked to me in an indissoluble bond, an eternity of presence without future. It's kind of interesting thing about the time of fraternity being like this kind of eternal present. We have come out of the mud together, and now the brother, whose existence is not other than mine, depends on me as I depend on him. Let there be no mystification about having a common nature. We are brothers because we are our own sons. Our fraternity is our common invention. This fraternity is an ensemble of reciprocal and singular rights and obligations. The badge for group membership might be the color of skin. End of quote. Laing, who follows Sartre's rather closely, including and especially in the mention of race and skin color, articulates willy-nilly one of the immense challenges of such a praxis-centered conception of fraternity, especially in light of that critique of political fraternization we encountered in Derrida. How can fraternity extricate itself from these empirical badges, to use the Laing term, of its pledge, the material anchors of its common invention, which it is so often wholly mired in? Under what condition can we, for instance, politically invent our skin color or our race? I don't mean to suggest, incidentally, that this cannot be done, as the whole history of the concept of political blackness, for instance, from the Haitian Constitution of 1805, which judged all Haitian citizens to be black, even if they were white, because it was a political identity and not skin identity, to the concept of blackness in 1980s UK anti-racism and so on, means that indeed one can invent these terms, and yet. And these badges are also accompanied, by Sartre's own reckoning, by myths. So Sartre says there is also a myth, a necessary myth of fraternity. Fraternity terror in particular is based on the myth of a new birth or rebirth. And here I was thinking of a, particularly emblematic form of this pledge and oath, which I'm sure many of you will have seen, which was this ritual, speaking of liberty, equality, and fraternity, of French members of ISIS collectively burning their passports. I'm just thinking this as a kind of very emblematic moment of this kind of mythical rebirth, a rebirth into a group of brothers who are only their own sons. Fraternity Terra in particular is based on the myth of a new birth or rebirth, the myth that we are our own sons, a myth that is inextricable from a frequently very loudly proclaimed parricide and often a silent, if sometimes far deeper, matricide, because of course to be one's own son, one clearly has to do without a mother. In the sense too, the brother is a brother of violence, and fraternity for Sartre, fraternity is a kind of, and this is his own formulation, a violence friendship. I think we live in a world in which there are a lot of violence friendships. The unity must be mythical since though the group is a constant process and project of totalization, the group itself is inexistent. So one of the things that Sartre alerts us to is that part of the violence and the violence of this project of unification and terror is based on the implicit recognition that the group has no kind of ontological consistency, like the French people doesn't exist, you know, the fraternity of brothers doesn't really exist in the same way that an individual would exist. And therefore, this non-existence of the totality involves this constant process of violent unification and also of myth. To rephrase the language of being a nothingness, the group too is a for itself which must fantasize or reify itself as an in itself, to fantasize itself as a kind of cause of its own existence. Be it as a past essence, as in myths of foundation, or a future plenitude, in kind of myths of messianic apotheosis. It is very striking in terms of the orientation of our discussion towards the question of religious enthusiasm that for Sartre we can derive the crowning affect and substance of religion, the sacred, as well as the law, from a reflection on the travails of fraternity terror. So one of the things that Sartre does in Critique of Dialectical Reason is to actually think, well, sacredness and law can be thought of as products of this process of fraternity terror, as a way of inventing a permanence for a group. And that's a real problem for Sartre. That's the whole problem of the group, is to invent its permanence. In Lang's summary, the sacred constitutes the fundamental structure of terror as legalized power. Without the law as the new synthetic product issuing from the pledged group, freedom in human relations does not intimidate. A kind of intimidating freedom is what the group is searching. Sacred power is thus a kind of inert, reified freedom, or as Sartre himself puts it, the sacred constitutes the fundamental structure of terror as juridical power. It is freedom returning to man as a superhuman and petrified power. From the intense violent reciprocity of the group infusion, where love and terror are inextricable, there thus emerge as seemingly necessary alienations, ruses or tricks of permanence, the sacred, law, and myth. But what emerges for Sartre is above all the concept of humanity. I think there's a whole interesting discussion one could have actually about the relationship between fanaticism and humanism, but we can maybe do that later. The pledge group, writes Sartre, produces its objectification, so it treats itself as a thing, as an object, as a particular material product in it, the pledge. So it's a way of exteriorizing yourself. It's saying we have pledged ourselves. We have pledged our allegiance to our own group and therefore to ourselves. But this interior objectivity, Sartre continues, which produces itself for everyone as impossibility of going back beyond a certain past state, as an irreversibility of temporalization, is not the objectification of the group as being. So we can't objectify the group as being because, of course, the group doesn't exist as a thing. It is the eternal frozen preservation of its rising or of its emergence. It is the origin of humanity, he writes. It is also the origin of inhumanity, could be argued by Sartre's own lights. As Sartre writes further in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, man is violent throughout history, right up to the present. Man is violent to the anti-human, that is to say, to any other man, and to his brother, insofar as he has the permanent possibility of becoming anti-human himself. End of quote. But how can we separate this dialectic of the group from what Derrida tries to deconstruct, namely a fraternizing humanization that would ultimately find its phantasmatic and mythical sources in autochthony, eugenics, birth, race? Or how, in Sartre's term, can we live, experience collectively and otherwise, the fact that our common being is not a nature but a freedom, or indeed an invention? It is of interest, by way of conclusion that Sartre explains the genesis of the notion of fanaticism, with which I began, precisely through the inability of living the group as a group, treating it instead serially in terms of individual psychology. So this is what he writes, still from Critique of Dialectical Reason. What people call fanaticism, blindness, is really fraternity terror as experienced in another group, and insofar as we, as individuals, treat it as an emotional occurrence in individuals. So it's as though to see a particular action as fanatical would be to individualize and psychologize what is fundamentally a kind of collective passion, in which, of course, the individual participates, but does not participate as a atomized psychological individual. What would it mean instead to treat it in terms of a dialectic of liberation and alienation, of freedom and violence, which has not individuals, but what Sartre calls common individuals, which is a different notion, in reciprocal praxis as its subjects? Would this allow us perhaps to suspend the liberal ontology or the individualist ontology, to put it all too briefly, of the discourse of fanaticism? Thank you.